I want to ask you, study-wise, when you talk about this perfectionism paradox, how we're not in a good place when we are looking at performance objectively also. Perfectionism is just such a poor choice to aim for.
Yeah, there's loads of data that has looked at the relationship to perfectionism and performance, and they all converge to nothing. Basically, the variance explained of perfectionism and performance is tiny, not certainly no different from zero, which is what we tested to when we tested for statistical significance. No variance explained by perfectionism in performance, which means if you're a perfectionist and you're not a perfectionist, well, your perfectionist is going to work a lot harder than a non-perfectionist, but they're not going to get as much out as a consequence. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. We touched on burnout. Burnout is obviously a factor here. Perfectionists burn out way more than non-perfectionistic people because they just push themselves way too hard. But there's another more interesting reason, and that's because perfectionism is a psychological trait that creates a lot of anxiety, worry, and insecurity. And as a consequence, perfectionists tend to be very self-sabotaging in the way that they approach their tasks. We've done loads of research now putting perfectionists in stressful situations and finding out what happens. And when you subject them to failure, particularly competitive failure, they feel a lot of guilt, they feel a lot of shame in those moments because they've just revealed some imperfection. And also, when you put them in situations where you give them challenging goals and tell them that they failed, but then ask them to have another go, you tend to find on the second attempt that they withdraw their energy and behavior because they don't want to feel that guilt and shame again. So they kind of remove themselves from the situation, particularly in challenging situations. And so this is the paradox, right? This is a paradox of perfectionism. On the one hand, you've got all this restless striving, but then on the other hand, you've got all of this burnout and this self-sabotage, and they converge to mean that perfectionists are no more successful than other people. And that's a really difficult message to spread. I've been trying to do that in my advocacy recently, and lots of people get it. Like, they see the data and they're on board, but actually letting it go is another.
How is glorifying being a perfectionist also a terrible idea for highly stressful professions such as those in medicine? Because when we're looking at the amalgamation of other-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism, I feel like there's no room or margin for error or for being a human. And we must always be precise. We must always be right. I'm talking specifically about medicine right now. And if we fail, it's just so hard. I know a lot of physicians never recover from that.
Yeah, and it's a super tough profession. You have to be diligent, you have to be meticulous. There is very little room for mistakes. And that's why there's so many safeguards built into procedures in high risk and high pressure professions. It has to be. It's the same with nuclear power. It's the same with the airline industry. There is an implicit acknowledgement in those processes and safeguards that people are imperfect and mistakes will slip through the net. And no matter how diligent or conscientious we are, it's going to happen. And as much as we try to avoid it at all costs, nevertheless, there will be isolated incidents throughout a long career where you may make a mistake, and that mistake might have quite just dramatic consequences. And I think within professions like those high-risk professions, it is so important that we recognize that we are human beings at the end of the day, and that we're conscientious and we're diligent, and we've got through a really rigorous selection process just to be here, so that we are very, very proficient professionals. And at the same time, recognizing too that if we overemphasize perfection at all costs, we're actually going to run the risk of creating more of culture that creates more opportunity for mistakes, because perfectionistic cultures and climates tend to be very failure averse. They tend to be not very good in moments of crisis, because the worry and the doubt starts to slip into our minds when what we really need is a clear head. They create an aversion to making mistakes, which mean we conceal and potentially try to disguise mistakes that have been made, or maybe not be as forthcoming with mistakes as they're made, which can create all sorts of problems later down the line when it comes to procedures and operations and all the rest of it. And so there's so many arguments against a perfectionistic culture when it comes to these kinds of professions, and an argument in favor of a culture that's open, accepting, that's safe, that allows us to share our fallibilities, allows us to share mistakes and talk about them openly so that we can learn from them and do better next time. That really should be a forefront to cultures where there's a lot of risk involved.